Thank you for joining us today. This is the third installment of our special United Nations Global Compact Academy series focused on uniting business in response to COVID-19. I'm Dan Thomas, the Chief Communication Officer from the Global Compact, and we're thrilled to continue to hear from leaders around the world and to be joined by thousands of people every week. We appreciate your participation and we look forward to seeing your comments and questions in the chat. Today's session will take a closer look at the way that this crisis is impacting women and some of the things business, government, and the UN system can do to support women in the face of COVID-19, from immediate relief efforts to longer-term recovery strategies. All sectors of society, including business, have a responsibility to ensure actions taken to combat this pandemic are responsive to the unique and unequal impacts on women. And we'll discuss how to support women and how to encourage gender equality with three esteemed leaders today. I'd like to welcome Professor Margaret Kobia, who leads the Kenyan Ministry of Public Service and Gender as Cabinet Secretary. Professor Kobia has also served as the chairperson of the Public Service Commission and as the vice chair of the Judicial Service Commission. She's also a member of the United Nations Committee of Experts in Public Administration that advises the UN Economic and Social Council. Professor Kobia, thank you for joining us from Nairobi, Kenya. And we have Anne Cairns, the Executive Vice Chair of MasterCard. She's also the Global Co-Chair of the 30% Club and Chair of the Financial Alliance for Women and a member of the UK Government's Artificial Intelligence Council. Before joining MasterCard, Anne had a distinguished career in banking and worked as an engineer on offshore oil rigs. And last but not least, Lisa Kingo, the Chief Executive Officer and the Executive Director of the United Nations Global Compact, the world's largest corporate sustainability initiative. Thank you to all of you for being on our panel today.
Thank you.
So I'd like to just kick off by asking each of you just to reflect on the impact this crisis is having on your communities, your countries, and in particular, what has the impact been on women? First of all, you, Professor Kobia from Kenya, what's going on there?
Thank you, Dan and the panelists for this opportunity to share my experience regarding coronavirus and the impact it has on Kenya and especially on women. This is what really took the country by surprise, and we have seen about job losses. 60% of the jobs lost is from women. And particularly they are from women because most of the women work in airline, hospitality. They also run small businesses, keep small shops. Now with the lockdown, they cannot be able to go for their jobs anymore. That gives them a stress because they are not able to feed their families. And then another thing we have seen in this part of the world, Africa, and particularly in Kenya, the requirement by the Minister of Health, which is very good and we are supposed to be washing hands. But that puts an extra burden to women because they are the ones responsible for looking for water. 80% of the women live in the rural areas where there's no running water. Therefore, they spend a lot of time looking for water. There's now an addition to fetch water for the families to wash their hands. We have also seen an increased care and paid care worker for women that they have to do because schools are closed, universities are closed, everybody is home. That's put an extra burden for women because they are the ones who do all the chores and at the same time be able to make the meals, and also sometimes they expect and also to have resources like in financial to make sure they put food on the table. Because of that, we are already seeing cases of mental health and stress where women are becoming a little bit irritable because of the so many hours they have to keep on coping with this and difficult situation they find themselves with. And we have now in my ministry where I'm responsible for gender affairs, we have had cases increased by 30% on domestic violence. This domestic violence, we are finding like the women are the most reporting this case, and in my country, normally domestic violence is stigmatized, so people don't report as much. But we are seeing now 90% of the cases reported are from women. It's only a few cases where men are also reporting emotional violence, where maybe they come late and they have not been able, because they're also experiencing loss of jobs. They have not also been able to provide for their families. So definitely, a place like home where we are supposed to experience quite a lot of safety, we have found a 30% increase on domestic violence. That is worrying, and maybe at a later time I'll share what the government is doing regarding helping women cope with this crisis brought in by COVID-19 pandemic. Dan?
Thank you very much. Thank you. Anne Cairns, you're sitting in the UK right now, but you're a global business. How are you seeing this this pandemic playing out, and what is the impact on women that you're seeing?
200 countries around the world. So actually, we started to see things happening in China and then moving across Asia into the epicenter of Europe, and obviously now in America. As far as the company inside is concerned, we have many of our offices closed right now, in the sense that people are working remotely from home. One of the positive things I would say about this is that women have often asked to have a lot more flexibility with the ability to work from home. And the technology has been able to do this for quite a while. And so what we're actually seeing is, because of the virus, the ability to switch this technology on and allow people to actually connect and work from home in the way that we're doing now. And I'm kind of hopeful when we go back to normal that we will retain that flexibility. But of course, at the same time, unfortunately, we've also had to close so many schools, and there's hundreds of millions of school children at home as well. And so that's very taxing for parents, especially single parents, and often the women are carrying more load in terms of looking after the kids or being responsible for their aging parents in most countries in the world. And so this is an extra burden at this time of the virus as well.
Thank you. Lisa Kingo, what's your perspective? How are you seeing this impact affect communities, countries around the world, and the impact on women?
So Dan, I think it's amazing to think about that we were all celebrating the International Women's Day in the beginning of March, which was just a few days before the WHO called upon all of us and made public that we are now in the middle of a pandemic. We were discussing at the International Women's Day that things are not quite where we would like them to be in terms of gender equality in the world. And in many aspects, things are moving backwards rather than forwards. But I think none of us had expected this huge change that the pandemic has done for all of us, no matter where we are in the world, in our daily lives. And for me, there are in particular 3 different dimensions that I find really staggering when it comes to gender and the pandemic. The first one is that 70% of the women who take care of people that have been hit by the coronavirus in the world are women. So we should be very thankful to women across the world. The second observation is that in our recent academy, Guy Ryder, who runs the ILO, was sharing with all of us that the pandemic is likely to create more than 195 million losses of jobs in the world. And it will probably go very fast, as we have also all observed. And I think it's interesting to note that 60% of women's employment in the informal economy, where it is very difficult to keep a job, belongs to women. And also the fact that 55% of people employed in the service sector across the world, that is very hit by the pandemic, is actually women. And in the G77 countries, it's 88% of the workforce. So it really looks like women are going to be hit very hard by the unemployment that comes with the pandemic. And finally, I want to mention, like my colleagues also did, that the fact that we are all isolated in our homes has created all sort of unexpected aspects, such as domestic violence, that has actually increased by 25% and put many, many women in a very vulnerable and a very, very unpleasant situation. So I think we have a multifaceted set of pressures on women, and the dimension of women and the pandemic is one that we should be very much alert to.
Thank you, Lisa. Professor Kobia, COVID-19 is really threatening the health and safety of women around the world, as we've heard, from access to healthcare, domestic violence. What steps are the Kenyan government taking, and how can business and civil society support your efforts?
Thank you, Dan. The steps that the Kenya government is taking to help women cope with this pandemic crisis, government has already recognized they cannot do it alone. So government has brought in private sector, civil society, and also the people living under different circumstances. It's also in Kenyan context, women are not homogeneous. There are those women who live in the rural areas, women who live in urban areas who find it a little bit easier to cope. And at the same time, we find that there are women who are in extreme poverty. There are those who are in the middle income, and there are others who are few who are kind of well-to-do. Therefore, government has got different interventions to help women cope with this crisis. In particular, there are in the job losses, the government has found a way of giving cash transfers to vulnerable women, where the government has called in private sector, civil society, development partner to raise a COVID-19 fund. This fund is being used to distribute cash transfer through the mobile phones for the vulnerable women. We have also found in the past, whenever we needed to distribute the food, we used to call people to come and pick the food. We have realized now that is impossible because it cannot go along with the social distancing. In fact, we tried one incident, and the commotion that was formed, we just had to take a few moments so that we can have a cash transfer. On the other hand, the government has also alerted police stations. We also have a hotline we call 1195, where women, if they are violated at home or wherever they might be during this lockdown time, then can call on a telephone, report the incident, and then there are online counselors who may tell them where they can be able to get help. Then you may realize also these are difficult times because all the security, the enforcement officers and police, they are outside dealing with COVID and making sure the curfews and the lockdown are already reinforced. Therefore, there's also shortage of where people now can report when they are abused because everybody is busy. For that reason, that's why we are having the hotline and called upon the civil society to have more counselors who are on duty 24/7. Another intervention that the government is doing is raising their awareness through women movements, both in urban and rural, to let them recognize when are they likely to be stressful, when are they likely to be abused, how does it look, and where do they need to report. Government also, as the responses that the government is giving various responses in a way of tackling the pandemic. We have also asked the government to have gender lens in giving responses, because we have already seen even the lockdown and the curfews can come out with unintended outcomes. Much as it was really emphasized that we stay home to social distance ourselves, we are finding that staying home, even providing meals, people being together, and especially homes where there were conflicts, we find they are the one likely to have gender-based violence. We have also seen where the private sector is only 2 weeks ago when the private sector introduced the loan gogo balloon so that we can be able to have equity in internet across the country. So that was specifically brought, especially when we experienced the pandemic, that some far-flung areas where there was no internet, even connectivity to report the incidences was difficult. So the government has already done that, and moving forward, the government is thinking of slowly opening businesses, especially small businesses, so that women can be able to earn some decent living and be able to feed for their families. Because the biggest burden, especially in our setup, is when women are not able to put food on the table, they become irritable, and that also causes the way they relate with their spouse, causes some conflict. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Kens, what steps is MasterCard taking to support women workers as well as working parents?
So we heard from Lisa earlier that many people are going to be made unemployed because of this crisis, and MasterCard around the world has a huge payment infrastructure. It's not just card networks, but it's also account-to-account payments. We can pay through to mobile phones and so on. And so in many countries in the world, we've been working with governments, as Margaret has alluded to actually get money into the hands of people who need it during the crisis. And this can be unemployment payments, this can be child benefits payments, this can be small business support loans. And the good thing is that our technology helps us track whether the money is landing in the right place. We use things like artificial intelligence to do this. For example, we're working with the government of Thailand to check that the disbursements that they're making to their citizens are actually landing with the people they were intending to pay. And I think this is the kind of thing that we can do in the private sector, be just very good at what we do and very focused on what we deliver. But thinking about artificial intelligence in another way, we realize that we have fantastic tools that help protect us against things like cybercrime. And of course, when you have something like a crisis, you get a big increase in the amount of fraudulent activity around the world and so on. And we are actually offering free to small businesses and to healthcare industries, hospitals and so on, the ability to analyze their systems using our artificial intelligence tools and show them how to protect themselves against things like cyber criminals during this time.
That's a fascinating example, and in fact, that at the UN Global Compact, we're encouraging all business leaders, all leaders actually, to use the 10 principles of the UN Global Compact during this time as a kind of a guide to their decision making. And I suppose the principle around anti-corruption is particularly relevant in this case as things go awry. Lisa Kinga, how can business leaders best respond to this crisis from a gender perspective, would you say?
So Dan, I think you said it well by mentioning the call to action that we issued a while ago now. encouraging all companies, large and small, to incorporate and take guidance from the 10 principles in everything they do to address the pandemic. Today we are talking about gender, and I want to make sure that we also discuss the women empowerment principles, which were launched 10 years ago by the UN Global Compact and UN Women, with the view of providing guidance to companies for how to move more women up in the organizations, and sooner or later arrive at a situation where women have equal opportunities in business. So I think we started with 35 companies that signed up 10 years ago. Today it's more than 3,000 companies. And actually MasterCard is one of the companies that have joined very recently. I think the 7 principles are very practical, and I would really encourage that all companies, no matter size, take a look at this. I also think with the 10-year anniversary of the principles, we have come to the moment in time where we have to agree on what should be the target for the private sector when it comes to gender equality. And at a moment like this, when we are rethinking society, how we live and work anyway, why not make a firm decision that we want to have 30% women in top leadership, 30% women on boards? We know from science that this is what it takes for women to have an equal role in important leadership capacities in businesses. So that's what we are driving, and that's why we have launched our new Target Gender Equality initiative across the world with all our local networks. And we think this initiative has come at the right moment, because we need to have even more focus on women and on gender now that we are in the midst of a pandemic.
Thank you, thank you. Professor Kabir in Kenya, you know, it strikes me that you must be seeing this, the impact of this pandemic on some of the richest countries in the world, and noticing, you know, how hard it's hitting, you know, even the most, the countries with the most, you know, sophisticated healthcare systems and stuff. How do you in Africa? How does that look from your perspective? And how do you feel that's going to impact your own country and your own continent?
Thank you, Dan. I think what we are seeing initially when it started far away in China, is like we started thinking maybe it will never reach Africa. But unfortunately it is here, and it just demonstrates how interconnected we are. Therefore, when we are talking about gender equality, just as we have goal number 5 in SDGs, being able, all of us, to focus on those targets and indicators kind of gives us kind of good departure point. Therefore, I think it's very important that we see how we are connected, and I even want to thank Kingo, because MasterCard is here working in Kenya, is working with the youth on a program Africa Works. So, and within that, of course, there are also young women who are also being impacted. But I see the interconnectedness within the world, that we should be able to move together. And those frameworks which have been put for gender equality, I think we should be able to find a way of making sure we have measurable targets, which both the private sector and the public sector is tackling. Let me also say that when the pandemic broke here, we realized that it is testing the health system, but it's also testing the governance system of any structure of any country, administrative, and the capacity to harness and align resources. Therefore, businesses need to have strong institutions so that when they are able to respond to this kind of crisis themselves, they are strong enough. We also find that in these businesses also need to have organization culture and the values that kind of values diversity and inclusiveness. Because businesses that have a voice of women at the decision-making table, I'm sure they are able to bring the consideration for the women on the table on this when you are making these responsive interventions. Then they could factor in the real needs for women. It also shows that businesses from lessons learned, this is still very early. We are yet to do some study to see to what extent each women have been affected by this pandemic. But having disaggregated data is very, very critical so that businesses, as they try to empower women for gender equality, they are doing it from evidence-based kind of point rather than maybe not in a very coordinated way. Therefore, I think we are seeing businesses can come in to help women build their competencies and skills to make them more agile to respond to this kind of emergency moving forward. And I think it's still very early. I think as we move on, we should have very sound studies that can be able to tell us how we respond to future crises, and at the same time uphold the principles, global principles that support gender equality and women empowerment, because we know with the diversity and the inclusiveness, businesses do better, and then they are able to help the humanities.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dan.
Thank you, Professor. Anne Kens, from your perspective as a business leader, why do you think it's so important that women's voices are at the table, that they're heard in these times of crisis, and what needs to happen to ensure that they're at the seat, at the decision-making table, as governments, businesses, and civil society organizations face this global challenge?
Well, first of all, I think, we see some very good examples of women who are at the table. For example, Angela Merkel, who's over there in Germany. And I think we would look at Germany and say that it seems to be making the right decisions and managing through the crisis very well. The Prime Minister of Iceland, where everyone seems to be being tested, and Taiwan, who reacted very quickly to closing down their country, led by a woman. So there are some women at the table, Dan, but there aren't a lot. You look at the media, you are seeing a sea of male faces there during this crisis. And as the professor has just said, there's a lot of evidence now that basically having a diverse team to run a company or run a government or run any organization, it's been proven that they do run better. They're more efficient, they're more effective, they're more profitable. And I think that's just, they're more resilient because they have, a diverse view of which direction to go forward. And particularly in a crisis, that's not particularly obvious. I mean, I think when we come out of this, we're going to learn a lot of lessons about, what we've learned during this crisis. As I said, one of them is that remote working can work, but you do have to do something about education, and you do have to do something about bringing women up through into the STEM subjects that we all need so much. If one thing that we've learned on this crisis is that our life sciences are very important to us as a planet, and getting more women to go into biology, chemistry, developing the vaccines and so on, into those STEM subjects will be very important for the future, so that we have the best and the brightest. Here at MasterCard, we have a program called Girls for Tech that we've rolled out to 800,000 girls around the world, and we've just brought it online, and we brought it online very quickly because of where we are now, and so we can reach many more people. And I think all of the different businesses that can do this. And by the way, I don't think that any company needs to restrict itself to stay in its own space in terms of things like investment strategies. We've invested 25 million with the Gates Foundation and Wellcome to actually invest in vaccine research. One of the great things about being a big company and a global company and a profitable company is that you can choose to invest in things that are good for the planet. And I think what this virus teaches us is we need global solutions to global problems. And in many cases, it's not the governments that are doing that because they're becoming quite popularist and thinking of their own country. But the big global corporations actually understand this and can stretch out across the globe and connect up different points like a big network. So these are things that I think will be very interesting to talk about in the future, especially as we all get together and try and tackle climate change, which is going to have a huge impact on everyone, but it's going to have a disproportionate impact on women because of all the things that we're seeing in this crisis time that are impacting women. It will be the same set of things that are impacting during when we go through massive climate change. Thank you.
Lisa, Anne makes a good point about the importance of women's leadership in this space. How is the UN Global Compact supporting gender-inclusive leadership, a response, recovery to COVID-19, and how can the global business community, really step up to this challenge and support governments and societies in coping with this crisis?
So I think there's no doubt, as we have just heard from both Anne and from Margaret, that this is the moment where we have all learned that to cope with global challenges, we have to come together, business, government, civil society, and really work together. Even though we have had to isolate in our homes, it doesn't work that we also isolate in the way we try to deal with this crisis, because it has simply shown us that we are completely interconnected and dependent on each other. So when we get out of the pandemic, there is the climate crisis waiting for us, there's the issues in the oceans, there are many other things. And I hope that the learning we can all take from the pandemic is that we need to work together as one strong global team. And we need multilateralism, the global cooperation, to move us forward. And then the way we try to promote that from the UN Global Compact is to put across frameworks where we can help put people together to come up with some of these solutions. And I want to mention again within this specific area that the Target Gender Initiative that is now running in 20 different countries, led by our fabulous local networks, they all have the purpose of working with companies, big and small, supporting them in figuring out how they can promote women in their organizations and ensure that women can step up as important decision makers, because we all know that a holistic management team makes better decisions than one that doesn't have so much diversity. So at the moment, we know that 82% of Global Compact companies have targets on gender. But I'm afraid to say that they are not sufficiently ambitious. And what we suggest along the lines of the 30% club that Anne is actually chairing is that we make a commitment and say, why not take the opportunity now to aim for having a 30% representation of women, not only in management, but in everything we do, also in the task forces we establish to make sure the company deals well with the pandemic, which is the Secretary General's proposal. So I think there are lots of good things that we can learn from the situation we are in now, but we have to be brave and pick it up and discuss in a conscious way what are the good learnings, what are the not so good learnings, and then make sure that we carry on what makes us an even stronger global team.
Thank you, thank you. Now, I'd like to go to some of the questions that we've had during this conversation from our very large global audience. We're seeing questions coming in from all over the world. But here's one question about what actions should the private sector take to assist female employees who are working mothers balancing childcare, but also the family's needs, and also their professional and their work-related responsibilities. Anne Cairns, how can the private sector help female employees?
Well, there's a lot of different things that the private sector can put in place. Actually, at MasterCard, we've been rolling out global maternity and paternity leave all over the world, 4 months for both parents. So and so that can apply, even in single-sex parents' case, for example. And I think the idea of, if you have both parents taking time off to actually be with their children, it creates a different and completely level playing field in the workplace. You're not looking at a woman and saying, oh, she's going off to have a baby. You're looking at a young person of whatever gender and saying they're going to go off and be parents. And it will change the way that you actually address the career growth of women, and it will also give a good message. And I'm laughing because Elisa's on the phone, and of course this is very prevalent in her country, I know. It will give a balance to parental life, to say it should be a shared responsibility. It shouldn't be the responsibility of just the woman to look after the children. The other thing that I think women do need in the workplace is certainly sponsorship and mentorship. And I think this is really recognized around the world. In the 30% Club, we have a fantastic mentorship program that is cross-country company. So for example, I could be mentoring someone that works in the oil industry, and somebody who works in media could be mentoring someone who works in MasterCard. So that actually you build a network of mentorship up in that way, and people get exposure across companies. One of the things that women really suffer with is not having sufficient time to network. If you can build mentorship and sponsorship schemes that allow them the time to actually network and grow their knowledge and their experience of other people and other industries across the world, this could make a very big change. And to Lisa's point, we know that the science tells us that 30% is the minimum threshold that you want to reach, where a group stops becoming a minority. I always laugh about women being a minority, since we know we're half the human race. What is it the Chinese say? We hold up half the sky. So I think, but if we can have that 30% rule throughout all of our business thinking, throughout our executive levels, our board levels, and so on. And of course, as I say, that's just the minimum threshold. Of course, I want to go to parity. This year in Britain, the top 350 companies actually exceeded that 30% level at board level. And kind of everybody went, what's next? And I went, what do you mean, what's next? First of all, that's an average, and there's 140 companies that are still not there. I said, but also, what's to stop us moving forward now and going for parity? And we only have a handful of women chairs, and we only have a handful of women CEOs. And I don't just mean Britain, I mean everywhere in the world. So there is a lot for us to do in the corporate world to change this. One of the things I've been acutely aware of during the crisis is how many panels I've seen that have been all men talking. And we were fixing that, but it might have been window dressing. Because when the crisis comes, you realize that the men are in the more senior positions, and they stand up and they start doing the broadcasts and the panels again, which tells you that, what we've been looking at hasn't been reality.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Kabir. This is disrupted, all aspects of life in Kenya and in every country. Do you see this as an opportunity to change the way your society, your government, your civil society, your businesses think about the role of women now and then going forward? How is it catalyzing change in Kenya?
This crisis is a catalyzing change in Kenya in the sense that is making us think more deeply. For example, I think all what women want in the businesses, on the organizations that they work, they don't want equal opportunities to maximize their full potential. Therefore, policies that the business put in place, they must be able to explicitly say the how. For example, even in Kenya, we have been saying 30% may need to be of either gender in any board, but we have not gone further to say the how. Therefore, you'll find where businesses have said the how, then it is easier to fulfill than when we are just said it should be 30%. I know in the executive, we have said when you are doing recruitment, you must have a that, but this that is achieved by A, B, C, D. In the parliament, where we did not say the how, and we left it that parliament will registrate on how the 30% is going to be achieved, we have taken 5 years to do that, and it has not found favor because in the parliament, most of the members of parliament are men. Therefore, this is telling me every time we decide on a target, we must be very clear to say how. 2, we also need resources. I think we are not short of commitment, even at a global level, what we will do for women for gender equality. But most of those commitments are not meant because we have not allocated resources. So being able to allocate resources to me is a big lesson. 2, the SDGs, much as they are global, in my view, what I'm learning now is for SDG to work, they must be actualized at the national level. Therefore, being able to use those indicators and targets at the global level, but at the national level, we must be able to see that happening. That is the only way I think we can be able to have some lessons learned. I can also see this is an opportunity where the government, the private sector, the civil society is holding others accountable. We must say, what does all this mean, taking into account now women are having difficult time facing this crisis as compared with men. We must be able to reflect and hold each other, those organizations that we work with, accountable, and to be able to see that there is a change. And for that to happen, I think skills of collaboration, partnership, I think now they have more meaning than in the past.
Thank you. And Lisa Kingo, I mean, the UN Global Compact is supporting businesses and government, civil society with that how around the world through our local networks. How are we doing that? How can the United Nations support companies on this journey towards sustainability, but also towards promoting gender equality?
So then, for the last 5 years, the UN Global Compact has been working with businesses across the world on making the 17 global goals a reality that also Margaret was speaking so well about. It has been the common plan, the 2030 agenda, all nations making their annual plan for how to achieve the 17 global goals, dealing with hunger, climate, gender, partnerships, good governance in the world. That is a wonderful plan, unanimously agreed by all UN member states 5 years ago. This is the moment to pick up that agenda and as quickly as possible unite around it again. I don't think there's a need to develop another plan because we have a very strong one. And in only a couple of months, the UN Global Compact is celebrating its 20-year anniversary, and it's 5 years with the global goals and the 10 principles. So we look forward to sharing with all of you what the contribution of companies, of the private sector, to the goals and the principles has been for 20 years and for 5 years with the global goals. I think it's impressive to see how 17 nice, clear goals can mobilize many, many companies in the world and many young people, because when it comes down to the fact of the matter, this is about creating a world that we can hand over in a relatively good state to the next generation. So we hope to continue working in an even more active way with companies across the world to make our SDG ambition a reality, where companies become even more ambitious in setting goals for climate, for gender, for water, but also ensures to really embed global goals and principles deep down into their business strategy, into their operations, and into the way they communicate, because that is what it takes. You need to be serious about running a responsible company, and it needs to be truly embedded in everything.
Thank you. And thank you to our audience for joining us today for this discussion on how business can support women during this time of crisis, with Professor Margaret Kabir from the Kenyan government, Anne Cairns from MasterCard, and Lisa Kingo from the United Nations Global Compact. We've learned a lot. Next week, our UN Global Compact Academy session will focus on the role of sustainable finance in investing in a more resilient economic system. We'll hear from the CEO of Enel and the Chief Investment Officer of Generation Asset Management, among others. In order to better serve our audience in Asia, next Tuesday's session will take place at 8 a.m. Central European Time, which will be 3 p.m. in Beijing and Singapore, 12:30 p.m. in New Delhi. But every session is recorded and available online after the event. And I encourage everybody to share these sessions with your colleagues and your networks on social media using the hashtag #UnitingBusiness. I'm Dan Thomas from the UN Global Compact. Thank you for joining. Thank you to our panelists. Goodbye and be well.